few days ago, when I heard Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's threats against Africa, I had two choices as a leader: remain silent or defend the honor of my continent. I am here today to tell you this: Africa is no longer a continent that anyone can threaten in silence. And I, Ibrahim Traoré, am honored to be the first to stand up against these threats. These powerful words echoed through the packed press conference hall in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a forest of microphones, his expression resolute, his voice unwavering. The room fell silent as the weight of his declaration settled over the assembled journalists, diplomats, and citizens. This was no ordinary diplomatic statement. It was a watershed moment in African international relations, a direct challenge to one of the world's most influential leaders. The confrontation had begun several days earlier when messages attributed to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu began circulating in diplomatic channels. According to multiple sources, Netanyahu had issued warnings to African nations considering support for Palestine in upcoming United Nations resolutions. The alleged message contained thinly veiled threats of economic and security consequences for countries that failed to align with Israeli interests. For decades, such behind-the-scenes pressure had been part of the standard playbook of powerful nations dealing with Africa. Threats, inducements, and manipulations had long shaped the continent's international positions, often forcing African leaders to prioritize powerful foreign interests over their own convictions or national sentiments. But something fundamental had changed. When the news of Netanyahu's alleged threats reached President Traoré, he did something unprecedented. Rather than engage in quiet diplomacy or simply acquiesce, he called a press conference and addressed the issue directly, publicly, and unapologetically. "Let me make this crystal clear to you, Mr. Netanyahu," Traoré continued, leaning forward at the podium, his voice gaining intensity. "Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv. We don't answer to Washington. We don't answer to any force that thinks it can buy us or bomb us into doing what they want." The room erupted in applause. Journalists scrambled to capture the moment. A relatively small African nation directly challenging a global power. It was a scene few had witnessed before. To understand the significance of this moment requires understanding Ibrahim Traoré himself. At 36 years old, Traoré was part of a new generation of African leaders emerging across the continent. After taking office in 2022, he had quickly established himself as a champion of African sovereignty and self-reliance. His domestic policies focused on strengthening Burkina Faso's independence through food sovereignty projects, national industrial development, and reducing dependency on foreign aid and imports. But it was his approach to international relations that truly distinguished him. Unlike many predecessors who carefully avoided confrontation with powerful nations, Traoré consistently emphasized the dignity and sovereignty of African nations. In the global order, he had previously made headlines by expelling French military forces from Burkina Faso, ending what he called security arrangements that protected foreign interests while leaving our people vulnerable. This confrontation with Netanyahu, however, represented his boldest international stance yet, by directly challenging a leader known for his hardline positions and backed by significant American support. Traoré was entering uncharted territory. "I couldn't stay silent," Traoré explained later in the press conference. "Silence is what they expect from us. They expect us to be afraid, to bow our heads, to say, 'Yes, sir,' but I'm not that kind of leader. I'm here to fight for my people, for our dignity, and for our future." The press conference itself had not been planned in advance. According to sources close to the president, Traoré had called his communications team just hours after receiving intelligence about Netanyahu's threats. "We're addressing this publicly," he reportedly told them. "No prepared statements, no diplomatic language, just the truth. This spontaneity was evident in the raw emotion of his delivery. There was none of the careful wording typical of international diplomacy, none of the veiled language designed to maintain plausible deniability. Instead, Traoré spoke with the directness of someone who had made a moral decision rather than a political calculation. The response to Traoré's speech was immediate and electric. Within hours, video clips of his statement spread across social media platforms throughout Africa and beyond. Hashtags like #Africa will not bow and #We stand with TRAORÉ'S began trending across Twitter, WhatsApp, and Telegram. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta, the transitional president, shared the clip on social media with a simple message: "My brother speaks for all of us." In Guinea, Mamadi Doumbouya issued a statement of solidarity across Telegram groups frequented by Pan-African youth. Traoré's words were being shared and celebrated as a rallying cry. These reactions weren't just expressions of support for Burkina Faso. They represented something deeper, a continental yearning for leaders willing to assert African dignity on the global stage. For generations, many Africans had watched their leaders defer to former colonial powers and other influential nations, often at the expense of their own citizens' interests. Traoré's defiance tapped into a profound desire for a different kind of international relationship. When I heard President Traoré speak, I felt something I haven't felt before. Pride in an African leader standing up to the big powers, said Amandata Dayo, a student at the University of Ouagadougou, who attended the press conference. Usually, our leaders make these compromises in private, and we just have to accept whatever decisions are made about our futures. This time, we saw our president defend our honor publicly. The physical setting of Traoré's declaration added to its symbolic power. He spoke not from a luxurious presidential palace, but from the People's Assembly Hall, a modest structure in central Ouagadougou, accessible to ordinary citizens. The hall was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds more, gathered outside listening through loudspeakers. This choice of venue reflected Traoré's consistent emphasis on bringing diplomacy out of elite circles and making it accountable to the public. Netanyahu's office initially declined to comment on Traoré's statements, neither confirming nor denying the original threats. This silence spoke volumes to many observers. It suggested that the Israeli government had not anticipated such a public and forceful pushback and was recalibrating its approach. Western media coverage of the confrontation was notably limited. Major international news outlets that typically provide extensive coverage of any diplomatic tensions involving Israel gave the story minimal attention. This selective silence did not go unnoticed across Africa, where it was widely interpreted as further evidence of media bias. The Western media isn't covering this because it doesn't fit their narrative, explained Dr. Fatou Sow, a political analyst at the Pan-African Institute for Strategic Studies. They prefer stories about Africa that focus on crises, conflicts, or Western aid. A story about an African leader asserting sovereignty and challenging a Western ally doesn't match their framing of the continent. In the absence of mainstream coverage, alternative media channels across Africa amplified the story. Radio programs discussed the implications of Traoré's stance. WhatsApp groups shared translations of his speech in dozens of languages. Community gatherings in villages and urban neighborhoods became forums for debate about what this moment meant for African international relations. The confrontation with Netanyahu was about much more than a specific diplomatic disagreement. It represented a fundamental question of sovereignty, the right of African nations to make their own choices, set their own foreign policies, and determine their own futures without external coercion. For too long, foreign powers have treated Africa like a chessboard. He elaborated in a follow-up interview with Pan-African News Network. They move their pieces, soldiers, money, companies, and expect us to sit quietly while they play their game. Not anymore. This vision of sovereignty extended beyond Burkina Faso. Traoré had been instrumental in strengthening the Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense and economic cooperation pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This regional alliance had explicitly positioned itself as an alternative to foreign-dominated security arrangements in the region. Across the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, we're building an alliance, Traoré explained. We call it the Alliance of Sahel States, and it's about standing together, protecting each other, and building a future where Africa calls the shots. The alliance represented a new model of regional cooperation, one focused on collective self-reliance, rather than dependence on external powers. By pooling resources, coordinating security efforts, and developing shared economic policies, these countries were creating systems that reduced their vulnerability to external pressure. This regional approach proved particularly relevant in the aftermath of Traoré's challenge to Netanyahu. When reports emerged that Israeli officials were considering economic retaliation against Burkina Faso, the Alliance of Sahel States issued a joint statement. An attack on one is an attack on all. Any economic or security measures taken against Burkina Faso will be met with a unified response from all alliance members. This solidarity significantly altered the calculus for potential retaliation. What might have been a manageable diplomatic spat with a single country now risked escalating into a regional confrontation. It was a tangible demonstration of how regional unity could strengthen African sovereignty. The confrontation also sparked important conversations about what sovereignty truly means in the modern world. For many African nations, formal political independence had not translated into genuine self-determination. Economic dependencies, security arrangements, and financial structures often kept them tethered to former colonial powers and other influential nations. Political independence without economic sovereignty is an empty shell, Traoré often said. His vision of sovereignty was comprehensive, encompassing economic self-reliance, security autonomy, and genuine political independence. This vision resonated deeply across a continent where many countries were questioning long-standing arrangements with foreign powers. In recent years, several African nations had begun renegotiating resource extraction contracts, reconsidering military-based agreements, and seeking alternative economic partnerships beyond traditional Western allies. On the streets of Ouagadougou, public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of Traoré's stance. Spontaneous demonstrations of solidarity emerged in neighborhoods throughout the capital and in regional centers like Bobo-Dioulasso and Koudougou. These weren't government-organized rallies, but genuine expressions of public sentiment. Our president spoke what has been in our hearts for generations, said Ibrahim Traoré, a mechanic who participated in a solidarity march in Ouagadougou. We are tired of being treated like children who can be threatened or bribed. We are a sovereign nation with our own dignity. This popular support provided crucial backing for Traoré's position. It demonstrated that his defiance wasn't merely a personal stance, but reflected the will of his people. This alignment between leadership and popular sentiment represented a powerful force in international relations, one that external pressures would struggle to overcome. Traoré's stance against Netanyahu accelerated conversations about sovereignty across the continent. Leaders who had previously been hesitant to challenge powerful nations now faced domestic pressure to show similar resolve. Citizens began questioning why their governments continued to accept conditions and pressures from former colonial powers and other influential states. What Traoré did was remove the aura of inevitability, explained Professor Jean-Paul Ouedraogo, a political scientist at the University of Dakar. For decades, our leaders have operated under the assumption that certain powers cannot be challenged, that certain compromises must be made. He showed that an alternative is possible, that African leaders can say no when outside pressure contradicts their national interests or dignity. This shifting dynamic was particularly evident in the lead-up to a crucial United Nations vote on Palestinian statehood. Historically, many African nations had tailored their votes to avoid antagonizing the United States or other powerful allies, regardless of their population sentiments. In the wake of Traoré's public stance, several governments announced they would vote according to their own principles rather than external pressure. When the vote came, 16 African nations that had previously abstained on similar resolutions voted in favor of Palestinian rights. While many factors influenced these decisions, diplomats privately acknowledged that Traoré's public defiance had created space for others to follow their convictions, beyond its immediate diplomatic implications. Traoré's challenge to Netanyahu tapped into deeper historical currents within African politics. It evoked memories of earlier generations of African leaders who had taken principled stands against global powers, figures like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, Patrice Lumumba of Congo, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. These connections were not coincidental. Traoré had explicitly positioned himself as an inheritor of Sankara's legacy in particular. Sankara, who led Burkina Faso from 1983 until his assassination in 1987, had been known for his unwavering commitment to African dignity and self-reliance. His famous assertion that he who feeds you controls you had become a guiding principle. For Traoré's administration. In his office in the presidential building, Traoré kept a portrait of Sankara prominently displayed. Visitors often noted how he would glance at it during difficult discussions, as if seeking guidance from his predecessor. This symbolic connection to Sankara provided both inspiration and a sobering reminder of the risks associated with challenging established power structures. By confronting Netanyahu so directly, Traoré was consciously placing himself within this tradition of African resistance to external domination. He was also inviting comparisons and the associated risks. Many of the leaders who had most forcefully challenged global power structures had met violent ends, often with the covert involvement of foreign intelligence agencies. These historical parallels were not lost on the Burkina people. Security around the presidential palace was visibly increased in the days following Traoré's speech. Citizens organized volunteer watch groups in neighborhoods throughout Ouagadougou. A viral message circulated on WhatsApp calling on people to protect our president as he protects our dignity. Traoré himself acknowledged these concerns, but remained resolute. "I know the risks," he said in an address to military officers. "I know what has happened to African leaders who challenge the powerful. But I also know that a life lived in fear is not a life at all. A nation that cannot speak its truth is not truly independent." This courage in the face of potential consequences further endeared him to many across the continent. For young Africans in particular, Traoré represented a new kind of leadership, one willing to accept personal risk in defense of national and continental dignity. "He's not just talking about sovereignty, he's living it," said Emmanuel Kessie, a Ghanaian activist who organized solidarity rallies in Accra. "That's what makes him different from leaders who make fiery speeches, but then quietly do whatever powerful countries want." The potential dangers weren't limited to physical threats. Economic retaliation was a real possibility. Israel and its allies had significant leverage they could deploy, from trade restrictions to blocking international loans or development assistance. Many observers expected swift punitive measures aimed at forcing Burkina Faso back into line. However, the anticipated economic backlash never fully materialized. Several factors contributed to this restraint. First, Burkina Faso's growing economic self-reliance reduced its vulnerability to external pressure. Food sovereignty initiatives, local manufacturing development, and regional trade agreements had created buffers against economic coercion. Second, the solidarity of the Alliance of Sahel States, created complications for any targeted sanctions. Measures against Burkina Faso alone would likely trigger retaliatory actions from Mali and Niger, potentially escalating the situation beyond what was diplomatically manageable. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Traoré's public stance had transformed what might have been a private diplomatic disagreement into a highly visible test case for global power dynamics. Heavy-handed retaliation would only confirm the narrative of bullying and coercion that Traoré had highlighted, potentially strengthening sympathy for his position. As the diplomatic standoff continued, the Israeli government eventually adopted a more conciliatory tone. Rather than escalating the confrontation, Israeli diplomats reached out through intermediaries to suggest direct talks. This shift represented a significant victory for Traoré's approach, a recognition that threats and pressure would no longer automatically yield compliance. When these talks eventually took place, they occurred on fundamentally different terms than previous engagements. Rather than being summoned to receive instructions, Burkina Faso's representatives entered the discussions as equals with clear positions and boundaries. "We are always open to dialogue with any nation," Traoré stated ahead of these talks. But dialogue means both sides speak and both sides listen. It means respect for sovereignty and dignity. The days of one-way conversations are over. This insistence on mutual respect represented a fundamental shift in how African nations engaged with global powers. It challenged the paternalistic dynamics that had long characterized these relationships, where African perspectives were often treated as secondary to the interests of more powerful states. The impact of this shift extended beyond bilateral relations with Israel. Other nations began to adjust their approaches to engaging with Burkina Faso and its regional allies. Diplomatic communications became more respectful. Economic negotiations acknowledged the legitimate interests of African parties. Security discussions recognized the agency and expertise of African leaders in addressing regional challenges. "We've seen a measurable change in how foreign diplomats engage with us," noted Foreign Minister Gilbert Basso. "They no longer assume we will simply accept whatever terms they offer. They come prepared to genuinely negotiate, to find arrangements that benefit both parties." This new dynamic was particularly evident in discussions with China, Russia, and Turkey, nations eager to expand their influence in the region. These countries adapted quickly to the changing expectations, emphasizing partnerships rather than patron-client relationships in their engagements. Western nations adjusted more slowly, often struggling to reconcile their historical positions of dominance with the new assertiveness of African leaders. This hesitancy created openings for alternative partnerships, accelerating the diversification of Africa's international relationships. For ordinary citizens across Africa, Traoré's challenge to Netanyahu represented something beyond diplomatic maneuvering. It was a reclamation of dignity. In market discussions, university debates, radio call-in shows, and social media forums, people expressed a renewed sense of pride and possibility. When our president stood up to Netanyahu, he was standing up for all Africans who have been disrespected by powerful nations, said Moussa Wenkuni, a farmer from the Bougou region of Burkina Faso. For once, we weren't being spoken about or spoken to. We were speaking for ourselves. This sentiment was echoed in communities across the continent. From fishing villages in Senegal to urban centers in Kenya, Traoré's words resonated with people who had long felt their nations were treated as pawns rather than equals in global affairs. The confrontation also created unexpected opportunities for Pan-African solidarity. Organizations across the continent organized events under banners like One Africa, One Voice, and Standing Tall Together. These gatherings went beyond simply supporting Traoré. They became forums for discussing broader questions of African sovereignty and unity. What Traoré did was remind us that our struggles are connected, explained Fatoumata Diarra, an organizer of solidarity events in Dakar. When one African leader stands up to external pressure, it creates space for all of us to reimagine our place in the world. This reimagining extended into cultural expressions as well. Musicians released songs celebrating Traoré's stance. Artists created murals depicting the confrontation. Poets composed verses about African dignity and resistance. A cultural renaissance accompanied the political awakening, with creative works exploring themes of sovereignty, self-determination, and Pan-African unity. 6 months after the initial confrontation, Traoré addressed the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. His speech crystallized the lessons and implications of the standoff with Netanyahu. What we learned from our confrontation with Israel is not that we should seek conflict with other nations. Rather, we learned that when we stand firm in our dignity, when we refuse to be threatened or coerced, we create the conditions for genuine respect and mutually beneficial relationships. Africa has too often been told to wait our turn, to follow the rules set by others. But now we are writing our own rules. We are not rejecting the international community. We are demanding our rightful place within.